Welcome everyone to this episode of Climate Clarifications presented by the World Climate Institute. I'm your host, Barry Gardiner, and today I have the great pleasure of chatting with Lord Deben, who has just stepped down after 11 years as chairman of the Climate Change Committee, which is the UK's independent advisor to Parliament on how to tackle climate change. Lord Deben, thank you for joining us.
I'm joining.
Well, look, so much has happened over the past 11 years as you've been presiding over the committee. But perhaps one of the most significant things has been the setting of the net zero target and its implications for climate policy. Can you tell us how important you think that is, or if there are other things that you would put top of your list above it?
Oh, no, I think it's absolutely the most important thing because, first of all, the two words net and zero are so important. On the one hand, zero, we have to bring our emissions down as low as they possibly can be. But the net bit is important too because we forget that one of our problems has been that not only have we laden the earth and the seas with too much to cope with, but we've also reduced their ability to cope with emissions. And we really have to deal with both of these. It isn't a question of growing a few trees. It's about cleaning up the oceans so they can do their job. It's about regenerative farming so that we can actually have the kind of sustained, continuous sequestration of carbon, which once was true.
Yeah. And that net zero commitment, how do you think that's going to influence the financial investments that we need to actually turbocharge this and deliver all those things?
Well, it was crucial to have it because when there was the figure of 60% reduction and then 80% reduction,
that was under the original Climate Change Act.
Well, the Climate Change Bill had 60, and then during the passing of the bill, which you will remember was an all-party thing, the Climate Change Bill was invented by the Conservatives. It got the Liberals and the Nationalists all on side, and then the Labour government accepted that and put it before Parliament, and 8 people voted against it, and some of them are still around, but they voted against it. Otherwise, it was one of the biggest majorities Parliament had ever had. And so it's basically all party. And we decided halfway through that bill that we really had to go to 80% reduction. And we asked what was then the shadow Climate Change Committee to opine on this. So its first job was to say 60% isn't enough, 80% is necessary. But the trouble with 80% was that anybody would say, oh, well, it's not us it applies to because we'll be in the 20%. And that was particularly true of investors because they really didn't face up to the realities. Once it becomes 100%, once it becomes net zero, everybody knows that they are going to be involved and they can't avoid it. And that has made a huge difference.
It's really interesting that you put it back to the Climate Change Act and the way in which net zero has turbocharged investment decision making. Can you just maybe set out for people the way in which the Climate Change Act structured the committee's engagement? How does the committee go about talking to Parliament? What obligations does it place on Parliament? Because many countries around the world have looked at our Climate Change Act and some of them have said, yeah, that's a model we would like to adopt.
Well, the basic issue is that the Climate Change Committee is not representative. It is scientific and made up of scientists and economists. So nobody tries to suggest that we're trying to represent anybody. What we're trying to do is to analyse the facts and from that explain to Parliament what you would have to do in order to face those facts and begin the battle against climate change. And the cleverness of the Act is threefold. First of all, it has a budgetary arrangement. So the Climate Change Committee of experts, 8 or 9 of us, decide on what the budget should be for a 5-year period. But it was always well in advance. We're now on the 6th carbon budget, and that goes to 2038. One of the reasons that I stepped down, I'd already been over time, because you're only allowed to have 10 years at it anyway, but I'd been extended, I think probably illegally by the government. One reason I'd stand down was it seemed to me that whoever was going to take over had to deal with the 7th carbon budget ab initio, rather than having my fingers in to start with. But that will take us to 2042. So it's well in advance. And the great advantage of that is that members of Parliament are able to vote on it objectively, because they don't have to think, how will that affect Mrs. Miggins in the next election, because this is well ahead. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that because of the need to bring together two very difficult and different timing issues, we have the democratic mandate, which is 4 or 5 years, which you've got to refresh. You have the climate change demand, and we've allowed climate change to get out of hand, which is that you can't stop and start things. You have to have a continuous and permanent arrangement. So what happens is that the Climate Change Committee produces the budget, and of course in doing that it has to produce a whole series of scenarios, because it's got to be able to say to Parliament, this is what you have to do because the science shows it. But it also has to be able to say to Parliament, you can do it, and it won't cost the earth. You have to do that as well. So the scenarios have to be produced. And then it's presented to Parliament, and for the first 6, Parliament has voted in favour of each of these budgets by overwhelming majorities, sometimes not even a vote. But what is in the Act is that you can't then change it.
Yes.
And that is the most important thing. Otherwise, you'd have governments and Parliament changing it every time there was a by-election or a general election or something that was inconvenient. You can only change this if the Climate Change Committee is prepared to say that circumstances have changed so much that the budget is no longer applicable. Now, we're not likely to say that in any but the most extreme circumstances. So that's the second gate protection. But the third one is the one which I didn't really realise when we were doing all this, because of course I was a member of Parliament at the time when we were doing it. And that is the importance of time. You see, every year before the end of June, the Climate Change Committee has to report to Parliament on how well the government has met its targets. And we can't put it off, and the government can't force us to put it off. So it may be very inconvenient. Could be on the eve of an election, certainly on the eve of a by-election, but we have to do it by law. And so sometime in the early part of June, we produce that report. And as you know, the last one we did was an excoriating report in which we said the government was clearly not going to reach climate change, the net zero, if it didn't mend its ways. I think that will be a fair assessment of what we said. Then the government has got to respond to that before the end of October. So this government is going to have to tell the Climate Change Committee why its concerns are not valid. It's going to have to explain to the committee how it is going to reach net zero. Now, as we said that it seemed to us unlikely that it would reach net zero before Mr. Sunak made his changes, it is, I think, going to be somewhat difficult for them to explain how it is that he is still saying that they will reach net zero by 2050.
Well, you've taken us into very recent and quite controversial territory, because I think one of the most important things that you talked about was that cross-party consensus. And here we are, two politicians from different parties, different backgrounds, but both of whom are absolutely committed to the climate objectives, the Paris Agreement, attaining net zero, and doing it, as you've said, is the obligation on the Committee on Climate Change, to test the best and most efficient pathway, the least cost pathway to getting there. And last week, many commentators would say that the Prime Minister did more than fracture that consensus. He actually brought it back into the party political domain. So you've talked about the analysis that they now need to provide to the committee to show that why they believe they can still achieve the net zero targets. But can we go through some of the key areas where there's been a rowing back? One of those, of course, was the retrofitting of many properties to make sure that they reached EPC standards. That's the Energy Performance Certificate standards. Another, of course, was the ensuring that no new cars or vans that were fossil fuel were sold by 2030. Now, those were key elements of the delivery of Carbon Budget 6, were they not?
Yeah, so I'm a bit concerned about the immediate jumping to the have we lost the consensus argument, because I don't think we have. After all, we have been through a long period in which governments of all sorts actually have done things which were not helpful to that.
That's certainly true.
I mean, I remember Mrs. Beckett voting against the decision in the European Union to stop HFCs, a absolutely major source of global warming. And she was the Labour minister at the time. Now, I'm not sure that the ministry was entirely aware of what HFCs were at the time, I have to say. But I mean, at that time, the opposition, i.e. people like me, were attacking her for not meeting what was a necessary part of it. And then, of course, under...
Can I just push back a little bit on that? And I don't want this to turn into party political, but it seemed to me that what was distinctive about what the Prime Minister was saying last week was he seemed to want to paint anybody who disagreed or who wanted to go faster and put more effort into tackling climate change. He wanted to paint them as, in his words, zealots, and try to present his position, which was actually resiling from some of those more progressive policies, as the common sense, the common man position. And that, it seemed to me, was a more strategic political thing.
Well, I just think we've been there before. I remember all that stuff about green crap under David Cameron. And after all, we have this amazing fact that probably the toughest series of changes on climate were done by Boris Johnson. What he did at the COP26, what he did by setting the targets for 2030 and 2035 was world-leading. Yes. I mean, absolutely. Now, I never thought I'd find myself praising Boris Johnson, but I just...
Nor I.
But what I'm really saying is we have to be a bit careful about this. I mean, you can go back... I've been writing and saying over the past few weeks that the Conservative Party has got to remember that Mrs. Thatcher got it right. Mrs. Thatcher was the first major world leader to understand the science. She went to Rio, and then she went to the United Nations to say that we as a world had to do something about it. And so the tradition, the history of the Conservative Party is certainly within the consensus. I think that all parties do a bit of wobbling when they feel very worried. And I have no doubt that we will keep the consensus. I'm determined to do that, and so are all those of us who are unhappy about the decisions which were made then. We will be pressing for a resiling again to get back to where we ought to be and to go further, because the problem is that we have not faced up to a number of the issues which, if you don't face up to them, you're not going to get to net zero. Well, actually you are, because what will happen will be that as climate change gets more and more obvious and more worrying, governments will have to take action. It'll be more expensive, it'll be more difficult for ordinary people, it'll be harder to have a just transition. All those things will get in the way.
Well, you've led me on so perfectly to what was my next question to you, and certainly that's one of the things that I get most often asked as a Labour politician, and that's how can we ensure that it's a just transition to net zero that doesn't have an adverse impact on jobs and leave workers poorer off. Just how important is it to get that just transition, and what are the best strategies that the UK can employ to navigate that?
Well, first of all, I'd turn it on its head. If we don't do it, it'll be an unjust non-transition for everybody. There won't be jobs. We won't have the advantages which fighting climate change brings. We will not have the reductions in costs which are inevitable if we get this thing right. And we won't even be able to deal with the cost of living crisis which we face at the moment. So I do get fed up with those people who say, what about the cost of it, without ever admitting the cost of not doing these things. The costs of not fighting climate change are enormous in any case. They become even greater when you think that if the rest of the world, as is now true, is moving to do the things it ought to do, we won't be able to export to anybody unless we're doing it properly. People won't buy our products or our services in those circumstances. So the opposite is true. Climate change, fighting climate change, cost of living crisis, fighting the cost of living crisis, demands the same things. And so the overall fact is that it is a much more just situation if you fight this. The real issue is that although the total cost of fighting climate change is less than 1% of our gross national product, and although the total cost every year will be much less than not doing it, the truth is that some people will be more affected than others, and many of those will not be people who can easily bear that effect. We know that's the nature of change, it's the nature of that. So we've got to do our best to make sure that those who can carry the burden, carry it, and those who can't are helped in a very generous way. And that's what this is all about. And happily, in the Climate Change Act, we actually do have a specific responsibility laid on the Climate Change Committee to deal with fuel poverty.
Yes.
So it's not something we could ever avoid, even though we wouldn't have avoided it anyway, because its chairman feels very strongly about it, and I wouldn't have dreamt of that. But the real issue is that people are being frightened by climate change deniers who are posing under the climate change delayers. In other words, they say, we're all in favour of fighting climate change, we do believe it's happening, but we can't do anything that will really upset people. Now, I'm sorry, I don't
St. Augustine
believe
had a view on that, didn't he?
Yes. Absolutely. St. Augustine, I believe, said, Lord, make me chaste, but not yet.
But not
I
yet,
have some
exactly.
sympathy with this
Yes.
argument. And, but it is a thing that is impossible. You actually can't believe in climate change and say this, because if you believe in it and understand it, you realise the enormity of what we're threatened with and the absolute essential nature of urgent action.
Yes.
and you understand how much it costs if you don't do it. And these deniers who pretend to be merely helpful delayers are actually undermining the future of themselves and their children. I used to say their children, but even though I'm as old as I am, it's going to affect me.
Yes.
As long as I live as long as my father, I will certainly be affected by the changes that are happening to the climate, because the awful thing is that the changes are happening at the top end of what the scientists said would happen and not the bottom end.
Yes. And of course, they're happening now. These changes are happening all around the world at the moment, and we're seeing the increase in drought, the increase in floods, the way in which it's affecting our food chain already. So you're right, we are all going to feel the pain, but those who want to delay it are just going to make it more expensive to then deal with.
And of course, every year we leave it, it gets worse. And that's also a very important part of it. And I think now there are such amazing examples from our own country. For example, spring comes 17 days earlier than when I started gardening. In my lifetime, that has happened.
Yes.
So the blossoms come out at a different time from the pollinators.
Yeah.
So we are actually interfering with the mechanisms which give us life.
Yes, and evolutionary change cannot happen quickly enough to make sure that the pollinators catch up.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I just give a simple example. The local water company in Suffolk, where I live, has announced that it cannot agree to any new water connections to any new commercial business until 2032, because it has no water. The east of England is now officially called a semi-arid area. We are going to have large parts of Britain which will, instead of being that constant rainy feather we always thought we had, which will have long periods of drought and then enormous storms. And we're going to have to cope with that. And as an agriculturist, I'm a small farmer, I've always been involved in agriculture, I am really worried about the effect of that on our own ability to produce our own food. And of course, throughout the world, that is true. I've just come to this meeting from giving advice to a very large British company where we help them with sustainability in my business. And I'm beginning to have to be very tough with them about their supply chain because it seems to me that it is threatened in a way which even a good company like that, which has been thinking about this and working about this for years, hasn't yet realised the extent of what that means. Nor necessarily have they taken into account the resilience which is going to be necessary, because there will not only be the problem throughout the world, but there will be occasions when, because climate change hits poor infrastructure maintenance, as in Libya,
Yes.
huge disasters take place. Because the wind happens to be in the worst direction and there's a very high tide, the fact is you can destroy huge areas. And
Well, we saw that in the east of England just a few years ago, didn't we?
did.
It was within a hair's breadth because you had the wind and that high tide coming into the Humber at that point. We were literally
10 minutes.
within 10 minutes of actually a complete wipeout of that Humber area, that basin.
And with it, some of the most important infrastructure. The
Yes.
other thing that people forget is that all those transfer stations, all those gas stations, all those places where we pass on the water and the rest of it, we've never had to protect them at all.
Well, that takes us neatly on to the whole issue of resilience and adaptation. And I know that as chair of the committee, it's been one of the things that you've been most keen to ensure that we do not forget. Yes, let's focus on mitigation, but as a committee you have also paid particular attention to adaptation. And, you know, I wanted to ask if you could share some of the examples of projects or policies that the committee has identified that have been most effective in addressing those impacts.
Well, of course, the Climate Change Act itself recognised that, and that's why there is a separate committee, which is the subcommittee of the Climate Change Committee, which is differently constituted so that it brings in a wider range of technical knowledge, because this is so important in dealing with adaptation. I think the first thing we have to remember is that much of the adaptation has to take place because of the damage that we have done as human beings. We have made it easier for the water to run down the sides of hills and go into the rivers and get into a situation in which they flood the plain. So planting trees, rewinding the rivers.
Yes.
Because we've made them straight because it was convenient. Facing the fact that heavy machinery on land which compacts the land means that when the rain comes down, it runs off the top and doesn't go into the aquifer. That, of course, means, first of all, we don't have any water,
yes,
but it also means that it rushes off into the river and down to the sea, and on the way floods large numbers of people. And then, of course, we built on the floodplains, and we're still doing that. We still will not take the serious fact that it is stupid to do that. And we've done all sorts of other things. The thing that really annoys me most as you go along in our suburbs and cities, you find people have concreted over their front lawns in order that they can park their cars on it.
You'd be delighted with my front garden. I arrived at my house when I bought it, and it was concreted over. I immediately got the concrete dug up, and we now have a front garden.
So. Well, I'm very proud of you, and the fact of the matter is, you are only one, and there are vast numbers of
sadly,
people who
most of the street goes the other way.
We're still doing it. And again, if you don't allow places for the water to get in, you are creating the floods. And in London, I mean, I have a great deal of sympathy for the Mayor of London when he's trying to tell people, there is the underground service. It's the most wonderful place for rain to go down if we don't do something about this huge amount of water. It's a lovely book I bought. I went to the church fete, and there on there was a book written by an American serviceman who came to Britain for the very first time, never been abroad before, 1945, and he wrote about Suffolk, and it's beautifully written. And two of the things he said was, Britain is a lovely country because we never have the witheringly hot summers that we have in the United States. Well, I read this last year in the middle of a witheringly hot summer.
Yes.
He said it's gently warm through 3 months. And then he said the other thing is, almost throughout the year there are gentle showers. You don't have the torrential rain we have in the United States. Now that is 1945, in my lifetime. And today we have torrential showers, torrential rain. We don't have showers.
Yeah.
And we also have this appalling situation of weather which is discordant. I often think we shouldn't call it climate change, but climate disruption, because just the last month or two, what we've been saying to ourselves is it's very peculiar weather. It's extremely hot today and very cold tomorrow. Yes. The rain comes in vast quantities.
Yes.
And what we have to do is to protect our infrastructure, return to much more sensible farming, We've got to grow a lot more trees, particularly in the right place. And we have to make sure that we reverse the damaging way in which we have handled our environment.
So nature-based solutions has very much been a catchword over the past few years, but the importance of restoring wetlands or floodplains, making sure that we do put woodland back on the tops of our hills instead of sheep farming and clearing the shrubland. All of these could be part of an adaptation strategy, but what are the more built infrastructure things that your adaptation subcommittee has been looking at in terms of the work done with the insurance industry on flood resilience? Because there's really hard infrastructure as well that's needed here, isn't there?
Yes, and the insurance industry, of course, is in a terrible state over all this. We only have the sort of society that we have in terms of growth and business because we have an insurance industry. Two things we did in Britain in particular was to build the insurance industry and to invent the limited liability company. Those are the two things that have made our greatness possible, frankly. It sounds very institutional, but it is actually what is said. Because the problem with climate change is that it strikes all over the world at once. And so reinsurance, which you used to be able to spread throughout the world, doesn't work quite like that any longer, because wherever you spread it, there's something of these things that happen, as we found this year, where everywhere there was flooding, everywhere there was extreme heat, everywhere there were real risks turning into real danger, real damage. So the insurance companies are very concerned about flooding, and clearly the only reason that they give insurance for some areas in Britain is because the government has got a system which they back up, which we're coming to the end of, so it's got to be rethought through. And
this is what they call their flood program.
That's exactly it. But it was a sticking plaster, really. I mean, we haven't thought through yet properly how we're going to deal with this. I think that, first of all, we shouldn't be building where we shouldn't be building. That's a very clear thing. Secondly, we should be building houses which are fit for the future. Again, because of a very stupid decision by a Conservative government, we didn't have net zero effect houses in 2017. And we've built 1.5 million houses since then, which are not fit for the future.
Yeah. They will need to be retrofitted.
They will need to be retrofitted. Yeah. Now, what that means is that the house builders who could have done it properly for a very, very small increase in the cost of the house, all of which they could have taken out of the cost of the land, because they could have paid less for the land, still be a good deal for the landowner, but less for the land. All of that has now been handed on to the purchaser. So there are 1.5 million families in Britain that have a bill waiting for something between 20,000 and 25,000 because the house builders, all of them almost, hardly an exception, didn't do what they should have done. And indeed, one of them was the house builder that got the government to put off the rules. And it was because they had not prepared for it. The other house builders were furious because, of course, they had prepared for it. And that is one of the reasons why I feel so strongly about putting off the date for EVs in this country. We told people it was 2030. In June, we said this date is immovable. In September, we moved it. And when you get into that state, no wonder that the leaders of some of our best car companies, including Ford, were furious.
They made their investments and they wanted stability.
Well, he said, I think it's a brilliant comment. We want a government with ambition. We want a government with consistency.
Yes.
And I think he could have gone on to say also with competence and coherence. These are the words which matter. And I am very worried that whatever the government says in future will not be taken with the same seriousness as it would be if they'd stuck to their word.
Yes. I want to bring you back to something about renewables, and particularly to look at what has been to date a real success story in the UK, and that is offshore wind. We've seen remarkable growth in the sector, and we've seen the prices come down. But just this month, we had a hiccup, and that was the recent auction for offshore failed. And can you give us an analysis of why you think that auction failed to get any takers?
Well, first of all, because I have to be very critical of some of the things the government has done, but one has to remember that government whom I've just attacked for getting rid of the net zero houses was the government which enabled us to spend over £6 billion on the offshore wind, which created
Absolutely.
an industry. And George Osborne will go down into history as being the man who stuck to that and got that to work. So the offshore wind industry is, in a sense, an industry that the Conservatives should be proud of, because it's the one that they created in a real sense. But you do have to take seriously the facts of the market. And I'm afraid Grant Shapps thought he knew better than every piece of advice he got. Now, anybody in Britain who's had any work done, building work done over the last year, knows that costs have gone up as much as 40% in the construction industry. I happen to be at the moment rebuilding a pub because one of the things I've tried to do is to reopen the pub in our village. I know perfectly well that what I've had to pay at the end of the year compared with what I thought I was going to have to pay is hugely different. And yet Grant Shapps refused to accept this. And so when he fixed what is the sort of minimum price, is really what it is.
This is the strike price in the contract for difference.
It's called the strike price, which is the maximum price that you can get. It was far too low, so nobody actually applied for it. Now, what that means is that the bills of people in Britain will go up because offshore wind, onshore wind, photovoltaics are the cheapest way of producing electricity. And what we'll have to do is to use gas for longer and therefore much more expensively.
And this auction was for 5 gigawatt, wasn't it?
It was. And if you don't get that, you lose a year. So I get up in the House of Lords and say, can we redo it? Can we... I know perfectly well the law doesn't allow it, that's all right. We rush through an emergency law that enables you to redo it. The government won't do that, so we've lost a whole year. Just as we've lost other periods, because it is estimated that resiling from what David Cameron had started to do in the days of the green crap argument, so parallel to this, has cost the British energy buyer, you and me, ordinary people, £25 billion. It is extraordinary money, because we'd have had all those wind farms, you'd have had all that photovoltaics, you'd have done all that, and people today, think how much better we would have been off in dealing with Mr. Putin and his illegal invasion if we had been that further along. And the trouble is, the government constantly says how well they are doing. Well, we have done very well. There's no doubt we have done very well, and a good deal of that has been Conservative governments. But if you look at the last year, they have gone back on that. And that's why I keep on saying, remember Mrs. Thatcher? Do what she would have done. There wouldn't have been any of this nonsense.
Well, Mrs. Thatcher was one for the hard reality.
Absolutely.
So let me sort of try and bring us to a conclusion by talking about the hard reality. We know that many countries say, look, it's all very well for you in the UK. You started the problem with the Industrial Revolution. Now you're offshoring your dirty manufacturing to developing world. And at the same time, you're demanding that we meet the 1.5 degree global target. Well, you promised $100 billion a year to help us to do it, but you haven't come up with the money. So here's the hard reality. How do we finance global climate action?
Well, I'm not sure that we haven't come up with the money. I think we have now come up with the money, and we do have to say that Britain, the big contribution that Amber Rudd made at the Paris Agreement was to get people to begin to recognise that the rich countries have got to pay for the poor countries to move from where they are to where they ought to be, but move in a clean way. That's one of the reasons why it was so wrong to say that we'll go right into the 2030s and extend the amount of new production from the North Sea. Because how do you turn to developing countries and say to them, you must move directly, when all those American oil companies are trying to say you go through gas, surprisingly, because they want to provide the gas, of course. Yeah. And we've got to get back to the position in which we can say very simply, actually renewables are cheaper, actually we can deliver them, actually we've got the technology to help you do it, and we ought to pay for it. And to start with, we should go back on the outrageous, wicked decision which was to reduce our overseas aid from 0.7 to 0.5. When you are a rich country and things are a bit difficult, you don't cut it on the poor. Yes. That seems to me to be a matter of decency. I happen to think it's a matter of the Gospels. That is what you're supposed always to avoid. The rich man's table is still a rich man's table, and you don't take it out on the poor.
Yeah. Well, look, we've gone from St. Augustine back to the Gospels. We've covered everything from sheep on the hillsides to wind farms and financing of global capital. But it's been a fascinating discussion. I know that cross-party there is huge admiration for the work that you have done over the last 11 years. And thank you for coming and sharing some of your experience with us today.
Thank you very much. I've enjoyed it.